Evening came with high wind in the Borderlands, whistling through the scattered houses of the little garrison. All down the street, only a single tea house shone from within. Warm yellow lantern light lent the place a semblance of life. The so-called Borderlands weren't the border between two countries or cities. Rather, they were the border between the demon realm and the human realm. The two races belonged to different worlds. For the most part, the endless abyss ruptured the space between them. But there were always those few places where the boundary between realms were weak, where time and space were in disarray, and where the residents of the two realms would often end up slipping back and forth between them. And on occasion, in some cases, some would maliciously commit theft across the borders. Few ordinary people were willing to live in a place where the demon race could emerge from thin air and vanish like ghosts, skulking around one day, then killing and pillaging the next. Thus, signs of human life in the Borderlands only grew sparser by the year. Even when the dimensions of different realms began to intermingle in a prosperous city, the population would usually end up evacuating in a mass migration, leaving behind only the disciples sent by the cultivation world to guard the Borderlands. Lu Liu poured the newcomer a bowl of hot wine as he chatted with the few others gathered around their stove. "Brother, where did you come from?" "The south." "Out that way?" A few people looked at each other, their expressions understanding. It must be hard out there right now," they said. The newcomer raised the bowl of wine and frowned. "Who said it wasn't? There's a battle twice every 3 days. No one can endure that kind of torture." "Chóngshēng Mountain and Huanhua Palace both belong to the 4 major sects. Why are they making such a fuss these days?" Someone in the corner cut in. "Their disciples can't come face to face for a second without getting into a huge fight. Won't their sect leaders control them a little?" "How long have you been in this damn place where birds won't even stop to shit?" Lu Liu said. You've gone too long living under a rock. It's precisely because they have their sect leaders' tacit permission that the disciples have been fighting harder and harder." "Why is that, Liu Ge? Tell us about it." Lu Liu cleared his throat. It's quite complicated to explain. Do you know who the current head of Huanhua Palace is?" "I heard it's some kid." Lu Liu laughed harshly. "If Luo Binghe could be called a kid, then you and I less than nothing. This Luo Binghe is something else. He came from Changqiu Mountain sect and was even the head disciple of Qingjing Peak's Shen Qingqiu. At the Immortal Alliance conference a while back, he dominated the rankings. Now that was truly a sight." "If he came from Changqiu Mountain, why would he become the head of Huanhua Palace?" a listener said doubtfully. "Well, after the Immortal Alliance conference, Luo Binghe disappeared for 3 years. No one really knows where he went or what he did during that time. Shen Qingqiu said that he'd perished, so everyone believed he was already dead. Who could have known that 3 years later he'd make a grand comeback? He had even become an influential figure at Huanhua Palace. Then he forced Shen Qingqiu to self-detonate on the spot in Huayue City." "I never really understood that," said the newcomer. "This Shen Qingqiu, was he wrongly accused or did he deserve such a fate?" Who could say?" said Lu Liu. "That Changqiu Mountain is naturally united against outsiders, and they'll fight anyone who says anything. They've always been like this, holding relations over reason. They won't even let people talk about something as damning as that Anding Peak Lord Shang Qinghua fleeing to the demon realm. Huanhua Palace changed masters not long after that Huayue City incident. The old palace master went into seclusion and disappeared without a trace. Luo Binghe took power in his stead and kills anyone who says anything otherwise. Wait, all because of a dead man? Someone muttered. This dead man has made quite a few waves, said Lu Liu. Shen Qingqiu is from Changqiu Mountain sect, and he was even the peak lord of the second-ranked peak. His corpse should be by rights go back to Qingjing Peak to be interred with the former generations of peak lords. But the problem is Luo Binghe refuses to return the body. Everyone was imagining something along the lines of Luo Binghe whipping the corpse or putting it up on display, and their hair stood on end. If he refuses to return it, can't Changqiu Mountain take it by force? Someone asked. That peak lord of Baijian Peak is still around. Lu Liu shrugged. He can't beat Luo Binghe. What? The group's worldview was shattered. In the eyes of the world, the peak lord of Baijian Peak had always held the position of undefeatable war god. That this peak lord couldn't beat someone or whatever was honestly unthinkable. You don't know? Lu Liu asked. Ever since Huayue City, Baijian Peak's Liu Qingge has fought Luo Binghe countless times, but he's never won once. And that's not all. Luo Binghe brought Shen Qingqiu's body back to Huanhua Palace, and only a few days later, he personally kidnapped Qiancao Peak's Mu Qingfan. Qiancao Peak has always disregarded worldly affairs, someone said. They help the dying and heal the injured. So how do they manage to provoke this devil incarnate? Luo Binghe took him back to Huanhua Palace and told him to heal and revive Shen Qingqiu. Lu Liu sighed. The man had been dead so long he'd gone stiff. What was there to heal? When I see the two sects fight, Changqiu Mountain always likes calling Huanhua Palace the dogs of demons. Why is that? The newcomer asked. That's because, for some reason, the entirety of Changqiu Mountain, from top to bottom, insists that Luo Binghe is a fiend from the demon race, said Lu Liu. Numerous abbots of Zhaohua Monastery have personally testified that spiritual energy circulates normally inside Luo Binghe, but Changqiu Mountain still insists on calling him that. Those two sects go back and forth, repaying grievance with grievance, growing their feud larger and larger. The way I see it, one day their ships will capsize each other and no one will survive. So, in the end, Lu Liu didn't forget to comfort himself. Being sent to guard the border to be free and idle like us was actually a good thing. I really can't understand what's going on with this master-disciple pair, let alone those two sects. The person in the corner said, confused. Well, one theory is it comes down to a grudge as deep as the sea. But there's another theory, and this old Lu thinks that one is more believable. Let me tell you all. Lu Liu was just about to launch into another round of enthusiastic gossip when suddenly a burst of knocking sounded outside the door. Everyone in the room immediately raised their guard. All their mischief and exhaustion were swept away, and each individual readied their weapons and spiritual artifacts. The Borderlands possessed only rare traces of human life, being abnormally desolate. The members of their squadron were the only permanent residents of the entire garrison. The ones who had gone out on patrol wouldn't have returned so quickly, and the few remaining residents were even less likely to risk death by wandering outside in the middle of the night. No one inside responded, and after a while there were 2 more knocks on the wooden door. Who is it? Lu Liu called out harshly. Suddenly, a chill wind blew by and extinguished the oil lamps and candles on the table. The room instantly turned pitch dark, leaving behind only the dull red light of the stove, faintly burning. The silhouette of a man carrying a sword on his back cast itself through the window paper. the person called in a clear voice. 六哥, it's me. It's too cold out today, so I came back early. Open the door and let me warm up with a cup of wine. Ah. The group released their breaths they were holding and cursed. Old Qing, you trying to die? Just knocking on the door without a word. If we didn't know any better, we'd have thought you were eaten by a ghost. The person outside the door chuckled. Lu Liu felt something strange, but he couldn't quite figure out what. He said, "Come in," and opened the door. A gust of frigid wind swept into their faces, but there was nothing there. Lu Liu slammed the door shut. "Light the lamps! The lamps! The lamps!" He turned and formed a fire seal, and the flickering flame illuminated a few silhouettes. He'd yet to light a candle when he turned back around and stuttered. "Liu Ge, I wanted to ask you, what are you stammering for?" Lu Liu said, impatient. "There were only 6 people in this room, right? So why am I seeing what looks like 7? Dead silence. Suddenly there was a loud cry. No one knew who had attacked first, but screams and the sound of clashing weapons rose and fell. Lu Liu yelled, "Light the lamps! The lamps!" Everyone hurried to form fire seals, but their movements were too uncoordinated. The flames and silhouettes swayed widely and disoriented their vision, making it even harder to see who was who. Afraid of harming their own, no one dared to swing too aggressively, and so the thing that had wormed into their midst took advantage of the chaos. It was like catching fish in turbid water, a claw here, a knife there. As Lu Liu mentally cursed, something suddenly grabbed him by the neck. His eyes rolled back into his head and his feet slowly left the ground, unable to see what had grabbed him by the throat. Just when he thought his life would end right then and there, the door flew open and a whirling gale swept inside. Another silhouette charged in. No one saw how the newcomer fought, but Lu Liu heard an uncanny cry by his ear that sounded like it had come from the thing holding him by the neck. Its grip loosened. The 6 people in the room hadn't yet recovered from their fright, and some were lying flat on the ground. This new person snapped his fingers, and the oil lamps in the room lit all at once. He bent down to study the bodies for a moment, then rose. "They're fine, just unconscious." This person was caked in black mud, like he's just been excavated from a grave, and his face was covered in whiskers that densely obscured his facial features. Despite his lean figure, his face was that of a large bearded man's. Lu Liu finally stopped shivering and stared him up and down for a long time before cupping his fist. "Many, many thanks to this distinguished gentleman for your assistance chasing away that creature." The new person slung an arm over Lu Liu's shoulder. "This humble one has something to ask." "Please do." "What year is it?" As Shen Qingqiu had tumbled his way down from the mountain, covered in mud, half rolling and half crawling, he'd fervently prayed for airplanes shooting towards the sky to be destroyed 10,000 times. Destruction by spiritual energy implosion or by asshole, either was acceptable. Originally, most of the strategies he'd thought up to preserve his life had involved faking his death. But what was the point of faking one's death? The trope of plotting a fake death with a puppet or a look-alike while allowing the original person to flee had been done to death in TV series. So, the strategy he settled on was dying for real. That day in Huayue City, he really and truly had self-detonated and even done a good deed along the way, absorbing an enormous amount of the berserk demonic energy in Luo Binghe's body. To say that his meridians had been ground to dust was no exaggeration. Only by facing death could one return alive? The sun moon Dew mushroom flower seed was also called the flesh mushroom, and this name was entirely literal. Though this mushroom wasn't especially useful for cultivating, it still grew by collecting spiritual energy from nature along with the essence from the sun and moon. If you planted its sprout in soil rich with spiritual energy, nurtured it, meticulously sculpted it, and watered it with blood and qi, once it matured, you could cultivate a living body out of flesh. The body could grow just fine, but it was impossible to also create a soul via this method. That was to say, you could only grow a soulless, empty shell. You couldn't find a more suitable vessel. Plant a little shen in the spring and harvest a big shen in the autumn was no longer just a dream. But the flower Dew mushroom wasn't a Chinese cabbage, something you could simply grow with a handful of fertilizer and water. Shen Qingqiu had destroyed a number of mushroom sprouts before he'd cultivated one that hadn't grown crooked. A good while back, he and Shang Qinghua had calculated the coordinates to carry out this long-distance operation. Beneath the tallest building of Huayue City, they had set up a transportation array, and at the time when the sun was highest, Shang Qinghua had triggered a second array, this one for activation on Chóngshēng Mountain. The moment Shen Qingqiu's soul left his body, he had been sent into the mature Dew mushroom, which had been buried deep in the mountains of the Borderlands. 3 locations, 3 arrays. If you connected them with straight lines, they would have formed the most stable shape, an equilateral triangle. Reasonably speaking, it was absolutely stable, absolutely reliable. The only flaw was a certain person. Great master airplane shooting towards the sky was just too reliable. Shen Qingqiu had been worried about flaws like overlarge arms or uneven legs, or a crucial part simply not growing. But none of these problems had occurred. However, sure enough, using chemical fertilizer to mature the sun moon Dew mushroom flower seed had resulted in some side effects. Just after waking, Shen Qingqiu had waited quietly for a while, but he hadn't heard that detestable Google Translate-like notification. He internally exploded with joy. The system hasn't appeared! The system hasn't appeared! This big shot's changed hardware! I'm not going to reinstall a virus like you! Though he could only rest assured temporarily, he couldn't resist dancing in joy. Dancing in joy, my ass! His whole body was still buried in the ground. He couldn't move an inch. For a day he remained buried, gathering strength from his fingertips until he could finally move his limbs. Only after this did Shen Qingqiu finally, shakily, crawl out. Once he broke through the earth's surface. He didn't even get the chance to revel in the fresh air of freedom before he fell face first onto the ground. This body isn't listening to my commands again. This left him splayed on the mountainside. Shen Qingqiu spent an entire day walking while doing physiotherapy, right up until the evening, when his gait finally resembled a normal person's. At least he was no longer simultaneously putting the same arm and leg forward. The human cast they used had been based on his formal appearance as Shen Yuan. It didn't compare to Shen Qingqiu's immortal poise, but it wasn't a bad mortal container. It just had a bit of certain listlessness, the listlessness of a worthless pretty boy idling his life away. But because he'd used some of his blood while cultivating the Dew mushroom, a touch of foreign influence was inevitable. When Shen Qingqiu tumbled to the side of a creek and used a sharp mountain rock to scrape away his whiskers for a look, his new face was still 3 or 4 parts out of 10 similar to Shen Qingqiu's. Without a word, he repasted the whiskers onto his face. Finally, after managing to tumble his way to the bottom of the mountain, he grabbed a passerby and asked the year. Fuck, it's already been 5 years? He could understand that right after waking up, his body was uncoordinated and occasionally unable to move because he needed some time to adjust to the new configuration. But waking up after being buried for 5 years? What was with this? Also, a roast was a roast, but this body was practically bursting with spiritual energy. The original Shen Qingqiu's body had been quite abundant in spiritual energy when without a cure wasn't causing it trouble. But the difference between that and the sensations he had in this one, it was like the difference between 2 bars of battery, still enough to use, and a full charge, the second after charging and pulling the cord. He would even go so far as to say that he was a generator. Did this count as shedding his body and replacing his bones, changing his tendons and cleansing his marrows? Was this the drumbeat leading up to his own ascension to OP-hood? After so many years, Shen Qingqiu felt for the first time that he had acquired a lick of the dignity owed to reincarnated transmigrators. For the first time, his unskilled self would perhaps not drag down his seniors in the transmigration regiment. When he tuned back in, Lulil was rambling. These past few years, the demon race have invaded more and more often. All sorts of demons, ghouls, and ghosts have poured into the human realm. A major battle is likely imminent. Oh, I haven't yet asked this distinguished gentleman for his immortal name. The words, "Haha, this humble one is the talented Qingqing Peak Lord of Changqiu Mountain, the Xiuya Sword Shen Qingqiu of the Central Plains," veered off course just before they reached Shen Qingqiu's throat. Ah! So close, so close. He'd almost given them his old name. He couldn't think of another name in the moment, and after muttering for a bit, he resolutely said 2 words. Peerless cucumber. Everything that had happened before was onto smoke. From today forth, as he walked the martial world, he would use this ID, which had been plastered all over the comment section for years. After he spoke, Shen Qingqiu glided away, leaving only a room full of petrified people in his wake. After a while, the newcomer mumbled. He said he was peerless... What was it? Peerless chrysanthemum? Lulil guessed. Wasn't it peerless crown? No, it was peerless crazy flower. Shen Qingqiu had walked several tens of feet away, but at the sound of this, his feet slipped out from under him. Perhaps he would have to think about it some more later. Maybe switch to a different name. The first step to starting his all-new life would, of course, have to be proceedings with which Shen Qingqiu was most familiar with. First, for a prop, he needed a folding fan, one with a white silk base, decorated with an ink wash painting of mountains and rivers. Shen Qingqiu snapped the fan open and waved it before his chest, sending his long hair and whiskers flying. Perhaps his image wasn't ideal and was slightly unsuited to said prop, but that didn't matter. With a folding fan in hand, any badass act would be at my command. Shen Qingqiu placed one foot on a mountain rock and said, "Speak. Exactly what intentions have brought you to infiltrate the human realm?"